afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Using IEC 62304 Adoption for Medical Devices webinar that's sponsored by Polarian Software. It's a great pleasure today that we'll have a collaboration with a group of experts in this domain who will share their stories and unique insights on IEC 62304. Speakers today, I'd like to introduce Griffin Jones, who's a partner in Congruent Compliance. Griffin has years of experience in compliance and regulatory expertise, specifically for FDA and medical devices, as well as Jamie Cole, who is the VP of Technology at iCardiac Technologies, and has also extensive experience for implementation, validation of software technologies. And myself as the moderator and host, I'm a product manager, Reg Struck, and also certified in HIPAA and other regulatory specialists.
Hello, everyone.
The format today will be, I'll introduce our guests who will provide some insight on our topic today, as well as we'll have some predefined questions that we'll pose to the audience, and both Jamie and Griffin will lead the way. If I could ask that all attendees actually submit their questions via the QA chat panel on WebEx, I will moderate those and do my best to repeat them verbally within the time frame permitted. So today's agenda, again, I mentioned that there will be an introduction between both our colleagues that are here, a brief overview of IEC, some audience motivations, experiences from both our colleagues in reference to IEC, and then we'll go through some of the comments and questions, both on the audience side and as well as based on experience from the three of us. And then finally, we'll provide a few resources that hopefully that you can use after this particular webinar. So the first is, what is IEC 62304? And I will open this up to the panel.
Well, in a very summarized fashion, 62304 is a definition of software lifecycle process elements that has been recognized by the FDA. And although it doesn't prescribe a particular life cycle for its implementation, it has a very nice definition of the component process activities and deliverables, and a very well-written standard and very helpful for any software development organization to follow.
Excellent. I would just add that 62304 came about primarily, or one of the main benefits was the whole idea of agile development practices and life cycles was becoming more prevalent, and there needed to be a clarification about whether or not how you would implement agile development or iterative development practices. So 62304 was the first step by the standards people to start to open up and clarify that iterative development is a good thing.
Okay, and then implementation, any thoughts or ideas on the implementation of 62304?
Well, I came from a background where I was very familiar with other type of process frameworks that were used in the software context. Most of my background was in the software capability maturity model, which eventually evolved into the integrated CMM. So from a previous employment coming into a situation here about 6 or 7 years ago where I was looking for a different sort of framework for implementation, lo and behold, the 62304 standard showed up on the proverbial Google search and said, oh, what's this all about? So as I dug into it and started to consider its implementation, actually looking through the activities and deliverables was a major driver for our standard operating procedure quality system, and actually referred to it quite heavily to generate our first version of our software development lifecycle.
For me, my background was primarily in medical devices, so I had an 820 background, and the quality systems that were formed by that. Recently, so when I worked with Jamie, we did the initial implementation of 62304 into that organization. After that, after I left iCardiac, I've been primarily focused on other medical device companies as they attempt to adopt 62304 into their particular environments and tailor it to their particular situations. From the ones that are simpler in terms of the Class 1 device people all the way up through the Class 3 people.
Okay. And what are some of the common questions surrounding both the purpose and implementation that you've found in the past, both from experience and from clients?
From my point of view, some of the common ones are, it depends on the particular client situation. There's some that are very new to iterative development, and that's why they're looking at 62304 in my environments. So they have basic questions about Agile or Scrum or some of the other Agile practices, and they're trying to understand how 62304 would enable that inside their quality system and inside their development processes. Often it comes down to how can we do iterative development and have things pre-approved if we're not having a large phased and gated process that's more waterfall-like. So that's one of the interesting questions that you have to sort of tackle. Jamie, do you have some?
Yeah, I'm frequently asked to describe our software development life cycle, so it's always handy to cite a reference, and I'm always citing the 62304 is our standard reference. So there have been times when I've been visited by certain medical companies asking this question, and when I cite that reference, they are completely unaware of it. So it's a way to give some awareness and education to the particular community that I deal with, that there is a standard out there for software lifecycle process, and the audience I'm usually speaking to isn't really aware of that. I think they're generally familiar with the FDA's guidance on general principles of software validation, and they've had some background and training on how to evaluate that when they come into an organization like ours. And so to bring out the individual terminology and definitions that are provided in the 62304, those are very handy because, oftentimes we're tripping over terms and definitions. And so we actually took the terms and definitions, many of them, and created our own software glossary from that. So glossary and definitions is a handy thing. If all of us can be speaking the same language in these things, that gets us at least 50% of the way.
One of the common questions I get is, if they have awareness of it, they often ask, well, how have you chosen to implement it? So usually when I consult into someone and we're having the discussion about 62304, I find it personally helpful both for an internal document and it's something to expose to external people to take the time to briefly create a small presentation in whatever format makes sense and summarize your approach to implementing 62304. What was the things that you considered, why did you make the choices, and walk through the process about how you made those particular implementation choices, bringing out particular examples also and pointing to key people that were part of that process. In general, try to preempt some of the questions that people will have about how you did the implementation by creating a summary presentation that you can present them at the beginning. It's also helpful to onboard people or educate management about what is the software development lifecycle that you're choosing to use.
As a device manufacturer, why should I care about 62304?
Primarily because if you can't point to some reasonable standard of your software development lifecycle, you're going to have difficulty getting European approval of your particular device. So there's a requirement to define what your software development lifecycle is. If you're not going to use 62304, you have to point to some other standard or provide sufficient documentation that the agency feels that you're under sufficient control and that you're equivalent to the standard. It is much easier to not reinvent that particular wheel and instead take the existing 62304, and this is kind of mandatory. You have to understand it sufficiently and apply it into your particular context such that you are compliant to the standard in that way. The important thing is not necessarily the form and the details of what specific things you're doing, but you have to start from first principles in terms of demonstrating your understanding of your regulatory obligations, having a thorough understanding of how you actually do software development in your organization, and then being able to explain clearly why those particular processes and artifacts that you're generating are compliant with a particular standard, in this case 62304.
Jamie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think everything that Griffin said was exactly correct, and the other thing is to also see the bigger picture that presumably this falls within compliance in other areas for a larger context of quality systems, such as the Quality System Regulation 820. I'm sure many of the medical device folks probably can cite it in their sleep, and along with that, if ISO 13485 fits in with the quality system, of course, great reference. But the second thing in the larger context is, of course, risk management. So a 14971 familiarity and the quality system and this software development lifecycle process standard, I think taken collectively should be something that's a great defense for any medical device development that includes obviously the software component. So I would definitely care about it from a perspective of I personally don't think the QSR and the risk management standards alone, nor that combined with the guidance on general principles for software validation would be sufficient in this day and age. So I think it would definitely bring you up to speed on some more relatively cutting edge for our industry. Saying cutting edge in the medical industry can mean different things to different people, but I think it's one way to get current on what all that would mean.
Just to add to that, I like what you said. By demonstrating that you have understanding of some of these relatively newer standards and showing that you've had forethought and that you've begun to apply them into your particular context in a thoughtful manner, from my point of view as an external person looking into your organization, it suggests that you have an honest, open dialogue, that you have some degree of a meta process in terms of how you're managing change in a healthy way. It shows sort of a preventive action approach to your general organization, your quality system. All this sort of leads to a degree of confidence in the amount of competence, both from a regulatory point of view and a technical point of view of your organization. So those are all good things to try to represent and present to external people. So that's why you should care.
All right, so talking about why you should care, kindly if we could have maybe both of you share a couple of experiences in more detail on IEC 62304.
Sure. I'll let Jamie go first because I can then expand upon what he comments and then comment on an external one.
Well, definitely at the time that I was setting out on this journey with this particular standard was also coincident with an introduction into medical software in general and thinking about the possibility of the particular software package we were developing, whether that would eventually wind up inside of a medical device. So at the get-go, trying to take the high road from a software safety classification to consider, all right, is this a Class A, Class B, Class C type of software device, quote unquote. I hadn't even thought about that at that time. So this was kind of coming into a new awareness of how to think about software safety classification. So my first experience was, okay, let's get the grid out, and everything can be solved by a matrix, right? So let's look at this standard and determine, what is it going to mean for our company, for our software development team, for determining if the software we're putting together now or in the future will be a Class A, B, or C device. And what that caused us to do is first come up with a software risk analysis procedure that we didn't have before. So that happened almost immediately. I think that happened before anything else because, as many that are listening probably know, depending on the safety classification you determine, it's also going to drive the rigor of your process and the number of deliverables that you're going to have to produce from that process. So that was a very important thing to do first, and make sure everyone was on the same page of what that definition was and the process we used to determine risk and safety. From there, we actually wanted to determine a semantic or nomenclature, if you will, for our versions. So a major version, minor version, point version, the build number of the software would have certain indications to us. Not only was this a new platform we were working on, but how much of a iteration or incremental development was incorporated into the very nature of version number we applied. And in software, half of the job is what's in a name. What do I call the variable? What do I call the function? What do I call the version? And if that version can somehow imply what the content of the software is, that was our build and release process that happened next. So once we had kind of the bookends of the process, defining the software safety classification and how we were going to choose the name for our new baby, we set out to fill in the rest of the gaps.
Jamie made an interesting point about in terms of we started from determining the risk of the product. And when I've worked with other people other than iCardiac, that usually is the point to start, especially if they're greenfield, in terms of trying to determine what type of product what the risk level of the product is. So having worked with Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 folks, Class 3 people are the easiest in terms of we had to apply everything in that approach in terms of determining the degree of rigor in their software development processes. The more interesting ones where products were blended devices and it was not clear what their classifications were. In those cases, the tendency was to adopt the more rigorous approaches that were being called out by the risk assessment and be a little bit more thoughtful and thorough in terms of the processes and how we were doing the documentation inside our software development life cycle. So the mechanical issues around this were really read the 62304, understand what the purpose of all the different sections and all the different requirements were, look critically at our particular product that we're generating or service, look critically at how we were going to do it, and make a determination all along the way about how we were going to defend each individual aspect of 62304 within our existing software processes.
And the other thing that was difficult about that was we wanted to maintain one set of SOPs, but kind of had this forethought that we might be catering to different customers of the software or the device, imagining for ourselves, okay, if we are audited and we have one set of SOPs to gauge against for a Class A piece of software, how's that going to compare for a Class C device? And we don't necessarily want to have it all contained in one. So being software people, we said, okay, how are we going to factor out even our SOP set? And I think we had headed off on a direction to split them off initially to deal with that.
Yeah, so we initially tried to do a combination of approaches that inside our documentation set that would deal with both medical device and tools used by clinical research organizations. And that worked for us, but we found that it was a difficult message to convey to an external person because of the nomenclature that was different between our pharma clients versus our medical device clients. So eventually we decided that clear communications was the most important aspect of that particular process. So we standardized against a particular nomenclature, which at that time was clinical research organizations and pharma companies, and tailored our language about how we did our processes into the language that those people were familiar with. We made a choice at that point to potentially split off and run a parallel quality system, our software development system life cycle that was focused primarily on 820 and medical device language. That was spun off, but it was not necessarily used due to business considerations in the company at that time. So I'm of a mixed opinion about whether or not you can create the one software quality system and software development lifecycle system that describes everything, or if you should tailor it to the particular pieces. Philosophically, I would like the one solution, but I think it's actually more difficult, and my practical experience tells me that I need to create separate ones. So I'm inclined to do the practical aspect at this time. Even though it appears to be more work, it's actually more effective.
I have a question from the audience. In your experience, what are some of the challenges in the adoption of new processes with IEC 62304, and what were some techniques to get people on board?
I don't think there was any particular process from the standard that was difficult to get people on board, but I think my situation may have been kind of unique. My executive team pretty much handed the wheel over to me, if you will, and so to be able to operate in a fashion that made sense at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of resistance to that. I know from a previous company that I worked for, that would have been a really big deal. And so I'm thinking about what it might have been like in a larger organization, but certainly, the executive underwriting and endorsement is a big deal.
Yeah, I think Jamie's initial situation worked really well in the sense that his management was seasoned. So they had gone through a previous organization where they had tried it a different way and it didn't work as well as they thought. And they were reflective about their own actions and behaviors in that environment, and they chose to do something different. And the fact that Jamie demonstrated awareness and competence and was willing to engage them in thoughtful conversation and inform them, make decisions quickly, but also keep them informed about what decisions were being made, facilitated executive management and departmental management in terms of the adoption of 62304. My own experiences have been in small, tiny little companies of less than 20, and in some of those particular cases, the experiences that people bring to bear prior to that situation have a high influence on whether or not they're inclined to adopt it, both in the good way or in the bad way. So there's high variability, primarily based on people's previous experiences. When I work with very large companies, usually there has to be some type of significant trigger to why they're looking to adopt, in particular, the more iterative aspects of 62304 as opposed to their existing processes. Some of them are being driven by regulatory, where they need to have conformance for European standards. In other cases, it's seen as a business imperative due to competitive pressures. They're looking to be more responsive and get more value out of their people and their processes.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, just thinking about the question about getting people on board. Surprisingly, maybe not so surprisingly, sometimes the hardest people to get on board are your software developers. And so I think, and that doesn't just apply to 62304, I think it helps to say, hey, guys, girls, there is a standard here, and you're in a profession where these types of process activities and deliverables are going to be required of you no matter what the context. So the most difficult part, from a people perspective, the population for me has been getting our very talented and very skilled software developers to respect and appreciate what's contained within the process. So you know how that goes. You oftentimes are running interference for that and trying to supplement what's going on. I certainly, have lost a little bit of my touch on coding and developing software, but from a long time ago, had very much an appreciation for the quality aspects of a software development team. So I actually worked very closely with someone who was testing the software I was writing and saw how much grief I was causing them by the way I was going about it. So from a very early point in my career, I realized that you've really got to take a step back and see all aspects of the process and how you're affecting other people on the team. So I try to tell those stories to those that may not be aware of that and give them an appreciation for how this is going to raise the level of the lake for the whole team, and have some more conversations with the people on the team about that.
For me, I think one of the ways to get people more on board is to be very open. I've found that when people understand the reasons why the changes are being proposed and have some voice in terms of expressing how those changes will impact their particular work, both positively or negatively, they tend to be more on board. Usually, processes that when I attempt to implement 62304, it's creating a framework within which we can be doing regulatorily compliant software development. The lightest touch possible that I can do where I'm not being overly prescriptive to the team members about how they're doing specific aspects of work is helpful in terms of letting them make the choices about how to actually implement the pieces as long as they're meeting the spirit of the specific requirements of the standard. There's always the degree of specificity is always a degree of debate. Personally, I'm always willing to have that degree of conversation with team members and be willing to open up that particular process to other options that the team may bring. Or if I'm getting data that's suggesting that we're not being compliant in some form or fashion with 62304, I'm quite willing to also close the options available to the team members in order to bring us back into compliance. Openness is, I think, the primary way to do it. That's very easy to say. It can be difficult for particular cultures of especially larger organizations to see that degree of control at a low enough level in the organization that you can effectively do that. And in smaller organizations, especially where you have hands-on technical owners, that can sometimes also be difficult because they have strong opinions and they own the company, and they take the approach of it's their opinion that matters the most. So getting the input from the rest of the team members in some of those cases can be difficult.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next topic, and in fact is a good question that's from the audience that kind of applies to this. So first, the topic is, who does IEC 62304 apply to? And the question that came from our attendees is, does the FDA and EC require companies to follow IEC 62304, or is it optional?
It's optional in the sense that you don't have to follow it. However, if you don't follow it, you have to completely explain why what you are doing is equivalent to it. So the difficulty is that it's usually a simpler path to look at what the standard is, 62304, interpret how it applies to you, document how you're choosing to do that implementation, especially in those key places where you think you may be less consistent with what is standard industry practice. You should document why you're doing it differently, how you're doing it differently, and why it's appropriate for you to be doing it differently. While the agencies will never say that it's absolutely required per se, but that it's infinitely simpler to adopt it and then appropriately tailor it to some degree to your particular situation. That's been my impression.
Do you want to add anything to that, Jamie?
Actually, I can't add to that. I think that's most that I could say about it as well, and also something to keep in mind as people are considering the standard, that it does not cover software validation, so it's kind of entirety of the verification activities. The individual activities and deliverables are described, but you still have to wrap it up into validation plan, a development life cycle of your own. So it's necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, well
said. Maybe the right way to say it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And on to the next question. What is the biggest, or are the biggest problems implementing IEC 62304? Off the top of your head, what are a couple of things that you can think of in your experience?
Well, right out of the box, the first time you go and do it, you won't necessarily be sure that you're doing it correctly, and that's normal. So the process, you're probably replacing an existing process that is well-oiled. Everyone feels that they're expert in it. It's well understood. It's survived regulatory challenges, and you're now replacing it with something different. So that degree of uncertainty that's going through when you make that initial adoption is normal. So typically what I see successful organizations do, if they're not doing greenfield first product, what they typically do is they choose a pilot project first that's reasonable, that's not critical to the organization, and they do an initial implementation using that one first. And they debug is the wrong term for debugging their software development processes, but they at least have the ability to initially practice it in a live mode without having all the stress of having it be the most important project to the organization. So they do somewhat of a phased implementation by project. So that's one of the things that I see that mitigates it. The people that I've seen have trouble are the ones that attempt to adopt it across an entire division of 30 some odd projects all simultaneously, because there's not enough support to the entire organization to make that initial implementation and answer people's questions as they start to go through the process for the very first time.
Yeah, and I would add to that for me, and it might sound a little bit simplistic and even a little bit pedantic, but I want to speak the language. So when I see a standard that has a significant amount of its pages and a particular chapter on terminology explained, I want to learn the language of the folks in the industry that are doing the same thing that I am. And so I liken it to, going to a different country and learning the language. We all need food, we all need transportation, we all need a place to sleep, but communicating that and using the terminology of the country is something you want to do as quickly as possible. So for me, the biggest problem was, or the time element was immersing myself in the terminology and believing that this is going to be the terminology that everyone's going to use, or at least is going to gravitate toward, so that as I moved on to other projects and additional validation and defense of those validations, that the terminology would be consistent and be correct. So far, that's been the way it's worked, and so I'm happy to report that that's been successful, but it does take you a little bit of time to make sure you clearly understand the definitions and terminology that's being presented.
Mm-hmm. Another major issue that I see around implementing is legacy issues. So it isn't like entire organizations stop everything that they're doing and then cut over. So usually there's some degree of parallel processes running, or there's aspects of 62304 that are somehow folded into the existing processes. So figuring out how to make that happen successfully is retrofitting or bolting on 62304 in some appropriate manner into an existing quality system and software development lifecycle in a way that is coherent and trainable and explainable and defendable can be a particular challenge. There's aspects of making that cutover that seems easier than it really is when you get into the grubby details of running real projects. If you underestimate what that's going to be like, what you end up doing is you end up writing a lot of documentation that explains we decided to do it in this particular way that deviates from our procedures for these following good reasons. So you write lots of deviation reports that explain and rationalize is the wrong word, but in a good way, explain why you're making appropriate deviations from your processes on live projects. That degree of process deviation can be extremely stressful to particular kinds of organizations and their cultures. Some organizations are very sensitive to the degree of process change that they're willing to allow through a particular project. So if you misestimate that, you can cause incredible stress in an organization.
Next question, how does software fit into 62304?
It fits well. Obviously, it's to describe the activities and deliverables of your software life cycle, so it fits very well. What should we look for in software? You know, I think it goes back to the safety aspect and the risk aspect. You know, any time that you're adding a process to your software development team, you want to take into consideration what's the risk and what are the safety implications of what you're trying to do. So I think it fits very well for the medical device software community, obviously. For those of us that have been doing software development in a clinical context, it fit because we were also indirectly going to be considered for our role in that particular workflow. So any sort of medical data or medical device data systems, I know there's a rule out there for MDDS, and if you play a role in transmitting medical data, medical device data, et cetera, there's a role for that type of software categorization in this as well. So I think it fits very well, and I don't know of another standard at the moment that I would use in its place. So there's definitely always open to reading more standards. At the time that I found this one, there wasn't anything really compatible, so I'm happy that it came along. But if there is something else being developed, I hope that there's not yet another set of terms and definitions I have to learn. I hope that we as a community, let's all work together, join hands, and use the right terms and definitions as we go forward.
So the best thing about standards is there's so many that you can choose from. So one of the things is 62304 people tend to focus on the software development aspects of it, but development is a very broad sense. I've worked with clients who make very thin software that really is, all it's doing is gluing together existing systems that are touching medical information. And in those particular cases, they don't necessarily perceive themselves initially as developing software, but they are. And so 62304 is nice in terms of it creates the freedom to define a fairly appropriate software development lifecycle process for those types of organizations that are not doing heavyweight, embedded, large team software development. You can also do smaller team integrations of existing third-party products, which also touches on another aspect of 62304, which is calling out the issues around software of unknown provenance, which is a totally another interesting subject that perhaps we'll touch on later in this conversation.
Okay, we've got a great question here from the audience. What kind of software verification and validation activities do you recommend to clients who are implementing 62304?
Jamie, you want to go there, or you want me to take that one? So I'm the verification validation person.
Yeah, why don't you start,
All right.
and I can fill in the blanks.
So there's so 62304 calls out a life cycle process around software development. So within that, you should fold in the appropriate aspects of verification and validation. And you start by looking at the agency's guidance document and then how to do software verification and validation. And if you're a medical device person, you're also looking at 820 and the definitions about what verification and validation in that particular context is. Depending on whether or not you're adopting a agile, iterative process, or if you're more of a phased gate, waterfallish type of process. The validation and verification activities fundamentally come down to two aspects in the regulated field for the FDA. The first one is risk. So you need to identify what is the risk in your product, what aspects of your product impact that particular risk, and then you have to show how you've mitigated that risk, how do you discover that risk, how you've controlled that risk, how you've measured that risk, and show documentation that shows that you've made some type of assessment of what that particular risk is in the product. So that's one aspect, risk-facing. The other aspect that the agency absolutely requires is a confirmation of that the requirements were implemented. So there's a set of requirements, and you need to do essentially some type of verification, a confirmation that all the requirements are implemented as specified. And then above and beyond that, you take the approach of, well, you could implement all the requirements as you think, as they were somehow documented or transmitted. The question then comes down to, does this actually solve the problem of the particular stakeholder? Let's call them a patient at this time. So you're doing some type of validation. Usually that's a combination of different features and functionality to produce some type of result that the end stakeholder, the patient, or a doctor, truly cares about. So you're looking for a demonstration of that capability. And then above and beyond that, you're looking at all the ILID aspects of software verification and validation. And you're going, when I recommend it, it's going beyond what would be terminally called in my school of testing something called checking, which is a simplistic confirmation versus testing, which would be more of a thinking approach to how would something not be working correctly. So I tend to take a balanced approach between using easy, simple, automated tools or people to do a confirmation of requirements, and at the same time use human beings and their skills, abilities, knowledge, and having them look for risks that aren't even identified or risks that are identified but aren't necessarily mitigated well, or taking a very centristic view of how is this impacting the true customers of this product and how would they feel about the implementation. So making a value judgment at that point in terms of the quality of the particular service or product for that particular stakeholder. Jamie, do you want to riff?
Yeah, well, I think the question, again, was what kind of verification activities do you recommend to people? And so I'm just here looking at the 62304 standard, and there's a handy chart on page 27 of the standard that has a summary of what sections apply to what kind of class of software you're dealing with. And so you'll see in, for instance, a Class A, Safety Class A, there's obviously a subset of what would be required for a Class C software. However, there are some sections, like software unit verification, that applies to all three classes. So there's going to be certain sections of the standard that are just going to apply across the board. But something that we've done to accommodate that is we regard our deliverables from our process activities as something called a software configuration item list. So we actually list out, depending on the software safety classification, exactly what deliverables will be created for that software release. And they map very nicely to that chart that I just mentioned. So not everything will be done for every type of software release. And so the recommendation I would give is I would go back and look at that table of the standard and say consider following those types of activities depending on the software safety class.
Right. It's I also take the approach, quite frankly, even if something's not required, if by doing that activity it's not difficult, if it doesn't, and it would generate really good information, then it's worth doing, even though it's not required necessarily by the standard. So one of the issues around testing is that it's generating two types of pieces of information. One is all that set of activities and artifacts that you're using to demonstrate that you're regulatorily compliant. But then it's also generating information used by the business to decide whether or not they have a viable business product. And those are not necessarily well aligned at times. So I tend to personally split the types of activities and the artifacts that I'm generating and tend to be very clear in terms of which of those particular goals I'm attempting to accomplish with that task and activity and artifact. If it's regulatorily compliant, I know why it is, why it needs to be, and that's how I steer that particular process in terms of how to do the activity and what type of documentation to create. As opposed to if I'm trying to generate information from a business point of view and a business need, that's a very different type of activity. I may choose to do it in a regulatorily compliant manner so that I can use that evidence to support my assertion that the product is a regulatorily compliant product. But I'm always doing that in that particular case with a focus on meeting the business need.
Okay.
A little meta in my answer, but I can get very specific if someone wants me to go there.
Thank you,
I'll second that. You can get very specific if you want him to go there.
Well, we have 10 minutes left, so we'll see if there's other questions before that.
Sure.
We do actually have another question. One of our attendees wants to know if development platforms and tools are related to software safety class.
If the tools being used in development are an aspect of the safety classification?
Yeah, the platforms and the tools.
Ooh, very cool question. You want to go there, Jamie?
I wish I knew other varieties of development platforms and tools to properly answer that.
So from my point of view, from my point of view, everything involved in the development is an aspect that needs to be assessed. I'm trying to think of a very specific example where the tool choice would force the result to be a different classification for the end product. I have difficulty doing that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that my imagination is limited in this moment in time. I imagine that if you're using unproven technology and unproven platforms and doing it in a novel way, and you can't necessarily get good, objective, measurable evidence of effectivity or verification and validation results, your tool choices would add risk to your product to such a point that you may have crossed the threshold of some type of risk assessment. However, the risk assessment process tends to be focused on injury and death and risk to the end patients and not necessarily in terms of the probability of that happening. So I'm inclined to believe that won't happen, that you can't push it around in that manner. However, I'm looking forward to being challenged and seeing a real example where it does matter.
Another question we have here, another great one actually. We're a manufacturer of medical devices, which consists of hardware and embedded systems. How do I document my requirements and tests?
For both the hardware and the embedded systems? Well, it depends on whether or not you're the final integrator. If you are, then you have responsibility to contact the suppliers, even if they're internal, receive appropriate documentation from them, which usually should at least include a list of known problems so that you can make an assessment of how those problems will propagate through your existing system built on top of it, and whether or not it would impact your particular safety. Let's assume that you are the integrator. You have responsibility for both the hardware and the firmware, everything inside that product. You cannot pass that responsibility for understanding what that is off to someone else. Now, you may not have direct engineering understanding of what's in there, but you have an obligation to show due diligence and confirm that you've been attempting to get appropriate levels of engineering understanding of that particular component, and have an understanding of how that component integrates into your system, and an understanding of how that component, when it fails, or in some manner, will impact the rest of your particular system. So, soup and subcomponents that are third-party, at one level, we cheer when we're on the project because it mitigates or it reduces the amount of time we have to spend building those types of things, and that's wonderful. But then there's the cost, which is forcing yourself to go through the process of qualifying that supplier, tracking their performance in terms of their delivery, documenting the decisions about why you're choosing them, what their quality issues are, and managing that entire relationship through the entire life cycle, quite frankly, of the software development process. And even afterwards, after you've delivered it, understanding if they suddenly have issues that they find while your product's in the field, how do those particular problems that they find, how would they propagate into your particular field systems?
Yeah, and what I would add to that is something to just get that conversation going could be, if you are, as Griffin alluded to, if you are an integrator, is to request or have someone develop a traceability matrix that would either cause the ones that develop the embedded software to generate that and to really flesh out what the mapping of requirements to unit testing and beyond look like. That will start to fill in the gaps for that as well.
Okay, great. All right, so we're getting close to the end of the session. Some final remarks from both of our panelists?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll talk about important also. So first of all, I want to let everyone know I give a lifetime guarantee to all my presentations. So if you have questions, feel free to follow up with me. My contact information is at the end. Always interested in talking to people about their particular issues around this. From my point of view, around 62304 and some of the interesting aspects of it is, first of all, it's the real gateway into iterative development for medical device and pharma companies. And that's a really exciting time in terms of trying to blend that particular aspect of iterative development into software development processes. When I look back at some of the people that have started to implement it, one of the more interesting aspects is dealing with all the post-software development aspects of 62304, the maintenance aspects and the retirement aspects that are called out by the standard are things that are easy to brush over, but are actually end up being fairly critical as you go into an operational phase. So those are my thoughts.
What I would say is that, first of all, I'm an agile development proponent and enthusiast, and I was skeptical at first here 5 or 6 years ago whether I could achieve agile software development and comply with what the regulators wanted from software development, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm happy to say that they can coexist, and that is a good thing. And as Griffin just mentioned, it is a kind of an on-ramp to getting to describing an agile development cycle. So that's good. The other thing that I would comment on is, if you are already a software developer, if you're a software development manager, if you have a very good relationship with someone who does, find out how your team behaves naturally and create a process, create a life cycle that describes what your team already does. Try to avoid being prescriptive of what they do and rather be descriptive of what they do, and take the time to spend time with the team. Back to the question about how do you get people on board. Spend time with your team, understand what their natural development behaviors are, natural software development behaviors are, and describe those in your life cycle, and I think you'll come up with a winning process.
Yeah, I like that point. If anyone has an inclination to read about lean and the lean concepts, the idea in lean of go to where the work is being done, I find really applies in terms of process definition and how we're doing software development. Instead of sitting in a conference room with people that are managers talking about how we think we are doing it, go to the location where the work is being done by the real people, and then just observe and document how it currently is being done. And if that's sufficient, document your process in such a way that it allows them to have that process that they're currently using as a completely appropriate and sanctioned process.
Two other things I just wanted to, before we wrap up and thank our speakers, is that there are various resources. We've highlighted a couple here. One is that we do actually, Polarian has a dedicated web page on 62304 and some white papers and PDFs on that as well, so you can go to our website. Obviously, Griffin, his consultancy practice actually specializes in the compliance regulatory issues around medical devices, so congruent compliance. The other one I can't believe I forgot was actually the FDA Principles of Software Validation. So if you do a Google search for that, you can find that as well. Are there other resources that you can think of, gentlemen, that might be of use?
I have a whole list of them. Some of them are better at some types of questions than others. If you're looking for like a general understanding, LinkedIn can be kind of good, but it's mostly not helpful necessarily, especially if you're called into this, you've moved beyond the LinkedIn questionnaire level. There's a couple of really interesting consulting companies that are running blogs about 62304 and the implementation of such. If people contact me directly, I can point to them.
Okay, great. Jamie, any thoughts on that? Or?
No other references to add to that. I think if you've got the standard and some of the other things that have been mentioned, you'll probably be reading well through the week and the month. So I would start there and see where that takes you. Actually,
I do have one more. So it's the AAMI's Guidance on the Use of Agile Practices in the Development of Medical Software. It just came out finally. It took a couple of years for them to put it out. It's a technical something report. It's a technical report from AAMI. I find it extremely helpful in terms of describing 62304, especially for people that are trying to use iterative development.
Right, so AAMI technical information.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And there it is.
Yeah, I've got it up.
On that, you'll find it. Well worth understanding that. There's a large conversation also going on about how to interpret some of the information in there, and also there's a talk about a new rev to the 62304 standard with the intention of providing some clarification for some of the issues that came up during this conference call.
Okay, great. Just to let everyone know that this is a recorded webinar. We will actually make it available for everybody afterwards with contact information as well. I'd like to thank both Jamie and Griffin to actually take the time out from their busy schedules, and they both have their regular jobs during the day, so they've actually taken the time to provide this kind of opportunity. Again, thank you very much, Griffin and Jamie.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, and then from this, we're actually exactly 2:30. This wraps up the session, so thanks everyone for attending.